The first time I realized just how far the HOA was willing to go, it was 4 in the morning, and I woke to the sound of tires crunching on gravel that wasn't supposed to be there. I rolled out of bed, still half asleep, and peeked through the blinds to see a shiny black SUV parked squarely across my driveway like it was a personal joke at my expense. My own car sat trapped inside the garage. It wasn't the first time they had pulled this stunt, but it was the first time they did it in the dead of night. And that's when I knew this wasn't accidental, it was a message. The board president, an overperfumed woman named Cheryl who treated every patch of grass in the neighborhood as her personal kingdom, had clearly decided to escalate. I wasn't even surprised. She had already fined me twice for leaving my trash can visible for an extra 30 minutes, once for painting my shutters a shade of blue she claimed wasn't on the approved palette, and once for parking my brother's truck on the street during Thanksgiving. Blocking my driveway was just another weapon in her arsenal of control. The next morning, I had to cancel work meetings because I couldn't even get my car out. When I called the sheriff's office, the deputy sighed, took down the complaint, and promised to send someone when available. That meant they weren't coming. I ended up walking half a mile down the road to catch a bus, which hadn't been on my to-do list since college. Cheryl, of course, strutted past me as I was standing at the bus stop, sipping her morning latte in the passenger seat of the same SUV that had been across my driveway. She smiled at me like she had won a chess match and tossed her hair as if she was starring in a shampoo commercial. I gave her a slow wave and said nothing. I could feel her expecting me to yell, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. People like her feed off reaction. Deny them that, and you've already taken half their power away. That night I sat at my workbench in the garage, staring at the tools I had inherited from my father. He used to tell me, every problem has a practical solution. The trick is figuring out which solution embarrasses the problem the most. Cheryl and her gang had made a mistake. They thought they were the only ones allowed to play dirty. They hadn't realized I wasn't interested in winning a shouting match. I was interested in winning the war. And wars aren't won by noise. They're won by traps. That's how the first spark of my landmine idea was born. Not actual explosives, of course. I'm not insane, but something that would feel just as satisfying when it went off. The HOA kept blocking my driveway every other day that week. Sometimes it was Cheryl's SUV, sometimes it was her friend's Lexus, sometimes it was a different board member's Escalade. The message was the same. They controlled access to my home. They thought they could wear me down until I apologized for resisting their endless petty rules. By the fourth time, I had already stopped calling the sheriff. They would only send a car after hours had passed, and by then the offending vehicle would be gone. Cheryl knew exactly how to skirt the line of legality, never staying parked long enough for the law to matter, always pulling away just before the deputy could arrive. She was playing a timing game, but I knew how to play patience. Patience meant letting her think she was untouchable while I worked behind the scenes. One night I set up shop with plywood, nails, and a little ingenuity. My landmines weren't bombs, they were pressure-triggered surprises disguised under old welcome mats. Each one contained a powerful air horn salvaged from a friend's boat project. Step or drive over it, and the horn would scream like a banshee. I set 3 of them at strategic points. One right where the hood of a car would block the garage, one near the curb, and one farther back. To the untrained eye, it looked like I had just put down some mats to dry after washing them. In reality, I had laid out a symphony of humiliation. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post about it online. I just waited. The waiting didn't take long. 2 mornings later, at exactly 6:30, I heard the familiar rumble of an engine idling too close to my house. I sipped my coffee by the window like it was a normal morning. The black SUV rolled up, slow and deliberate, and parked across the mouth of my driveway. The second the weight settled on the mat, the horn detonated with a deafening blast. The driver panicked, slamming the brakes harder, which only triggered the second horn in unison. The sound was so loud it rattled windows. birds scattered from trees. Porch lights flicked on up and down the block. Cheryl scrambled out of the passenger seat, her robe half-tied, her hair still in curlers, screaming at the driver to move. He panicked, reversed too quickly, and hit the third mat, which let loose another ungodly shriek. By then, the whole neighborhood was watching. Curtains parted, kids pointed, and one neighbor even recorded it on their phone. I stood calmly on my porch, mug in hand, and called out, "Everything okay out there?" Cheryl's face went red as a tomato. She tried to shout something about vandalism, but her words were drowned by the overlapping horn blast. The driver finally floored it, tearing rubber as he shot down the street, the sound still echoing in the morning air. My mats sat innocently back in place, the horns quiet once the weight was off. By the time silence returned, Cheryl was shaking with rage, muttering that I would hear from the HOA lawyer. I just gave her a lazy salute and went back inside. What she didn't know was that I had already spoken with the sheriff. Not in the way she thought, though. After the third time she had blocked me in, I had gone down to the sheriff's office in person. I explained everything, step by step, and asked them plainly what I was allowed to do on my own property. The deputy leaned back, smirked, and said, "As long as it's not explosive, flammable, or a firearm, you're good. You can make noise if you want. Just don't damage their car." That was all the green light I needed. When I told him my idea with the horns, he laughed and said, "Hell, I'd pay to see their faces when that goes off." He wasn't joking. The video taken by my neighbors spread through the block like wildfire. Within 2 days, everyone in the HOA had seen it. Cheryl's carefully cultivated image of control was punctured by the sound of blaring horns and her flailing in curlers on a Tuesday morning. And while she seethed, the sheriff drove by later that week, leaned out his window, and called to me, "Nice work with the landmines." Cheryl was standing on her porch when he said it. I've never seen someone look so simultaneously furious and defeated. She wanted a fight, but the law wasn't on her side. She wanted control, but the neighborhood was laughing. That's when the real war began. Because Cheryl wasn't the kind of person to take humiliation lightly. She was the kind who turned it into fuel. And as I stood there that morning, watching her slam her door shut with a fury that shook her porch, I knew this was just the beginning. The horns were a spark, and sparks always start fires. By the following week, the HOA meeting felt less like a community gathering and more like a courtroom drama staged in a badly lit rec room. Cheryl had called it as an emergency session, which was just her code for summoning the neighborhood into the church basement to watch her flex whatever little authority she thought she had. I walked in late on purpose, coffee in hand, calm as a man strolling into his own surprise party. Every head turned when I entered. Cheryl was already at the folding table up front, flanked by her usual sidekicks, Greg the treasurer, who wore polos tucked too tight into khakis, and Denise, who treated every HOA rule book like it was scripture handed down from a mountain. Cheryl smacked the table with her pen, pretending she was presiding over the Senate. "We need to address the dangerous traps set by one of our residents," she announced, her voice shrill enough to echo against the cinder block walls. She didn't use my name at first, but every eye in the room shifted to me anyway. I took my seat in the back, offered a friendly wave, and sipped my coffee. Cheryl's face twitched. "Those so-called landmines," she continued, "constitute a public safety hazard. They traumatized not only my family but the entire community." She pressed a hand to her chest like she was about to faint. "Imagine if a child had stepped on one." That got a few gasps from the more gullible neighbors, but most people had already seen the video. They knew the only child involved had been Cheryl herself, screeching in curlers. I leaned back in my chair, waited for her rant to crest, and then stood. Just so I'm clear," I said, projecting my voice to the whole room, "you're admitting on record that your car was parked across my driveway, blocking my legal access to the street?" A ripple of murmurs spread across the audience. Greg shifted in his seat. Denise glared at me, clutching her binder like it was armor. Cheryl's eyes widened, but only for a second before she plastered on another faux smile. "That's not the point," she snapped. "No," I said, "that's exactly the point. If my mats hadn't been there, your SUV would have been in violation again. And if memory serves, you've all been warned by law enforcement that blocking someone's driveway is illegal." I could see the sheriff's words ringing in her ears like an unwelcome church bell. Several neighbors snickered. Someone coughed the word landmines into their sleeve. Cheryl tried to regain ground by declaring a vote to ban hazardous contraptions on community property. But Denise, flipping through her sacred rule book, frowned. "Technically, his driveway isn't community property," she muttered. She didn't mean to help me, she was just allergic to misquoting bylaws. Still, the effect was perfect. Cheryl's motion stalled like a car with no gas. The meeting broke down into side chatter. A couple of folks laughed openly, others asked if I could install horns on their driveways, too. By the time I walked out, Cheryl looked like she'd swallowed vinegar. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Her retaliation came 2 days later, dressed up in fine print. A notice appeared taped to my front door, printed in capital letters with the HOA logo like it was a royal decree. Violation: unsanctioned exterior modifications. Apparently, my mats counted as unauthorized landscaping features, and I had until the end of the week to remove them or face escalating fines. I chuckled and left the paper taped right where it was. Then I drafted a short letter, quoting the state property statutes, slipped it into the HOA's Dropbox, and waited. The waiting didn't last. Cheryl called me that evening, her voice dripping with the kind of fake politeness that could rot teeth. "We've reviewed your response," she said, dragging out the word like it was poison. "But I think you'll find our bylaws supersede your interpretation." "Cheryl," I replied evenly, "you do realize your bylaws aren't above state law, right? You can't fine me for protecting my own driveway. Unless, of course, you'd like me to forward this to the sheriff again. He's a big fan of my mats." Silence stretched. I could almost hear her grinding her teeth. Then came the click of her hanging up. The next morning, things escalated in a way even I didn't predict. I woke to find orange traffic cones lined neatly across my driveway. Each one bore a laminated sign with the HOA's seal and the words, "Reserved for emergency vehicles only." I actually laughed out loud. Cheryl had staged an entire fake construction zone. A couple of passing joggers stopped to gawk at it. One asked if the fire department was doing work. I just shook my head and muttered, "Neighborhood theater." Of course, I called the actual fire department. The dispatcher was baffled. No permits, no notice, no authorization. Within an hour, a fire marshal showed up, looked at the cones, looked at me, and then radioed something that sounded a lot like, "You won't believe this." He asked if I wanted to press charges. I told him not yet. Instead, I asked if he could send me a written statement clarifying the cones were unauthorized. He grinned and handed me his card. That evening, I printed a dozen copies of the fire marshal's statement and taped them to the cones. Then I left them all exactly where Cheryl had put them. When she drove by later and saw her fake authority plastered with official proof of its fraud, the look on her face was priceless. She pulled over, started collecting the cones in a fury, and one tipped over, rolling into the street where a neighbor's kid filmed the entire tantrum. The video hit the neighborhood group chat before she'd even finished stuffing the cones into her SUV. By nightfall, half the block was laughing about Conegate. Someone photoshopped her face onto a traffic cone. Someone else printed a meme about emergency vehicle Karen. The next day, I caught her stomping across her lawn, muttering threats about slander. But she wasn't ready to give up. People like Cheryl never give up, they double down. Sure enough, 2 days later, another notice appeared on my door. This time it accused me of reckless endangerment for creating disturbances with excessive noise. That one actually made me smile. The landmines again. She was so desperate to bury her humiliation that she was recycling her complaints in different language. I didn't even bother replying this time. Instead, I set up my phone on the porch with a motion-activated camera. I didn't have to wait long. That night, a car rolled up again. Different model, a silver Lexus this time. It parked neatly across my driveway. I watched the footage later, frame by frame. The second the tires hit the mat, the horn detonated. The driver jerked, scrambled out, tripped over the curb, and fell flat on the grass. The horn shrieked into the night, neighbors' lights flicked on, and Cheryl herself came storming out of her house in slippers to rescue whoever it was. My camera caught it all in high definition. Her slipping in the wet grass, screaming at the driver to get up, and the two of them running off into the dark while the horn blared like a battle cry. The next morning, I clipped the footage into a neat little 30-second video and dropped it anonymously into the neighborhood chat. I didn't add captions. I didn't need to. Everyone recognized the driveway, the mats, and Cheryl's shrieking. It was a Wednesday night when the first unmarked truck showed up. A beat-up Ford, idling across from my house with its headlights off, the kind of vehicle that looked like it belonged in a crime drama stakeout scene. I noticed it while taking out the trash, the faint glow of a cigarette burning inside. Whoever was sitting there wasn't a neighbor, and definitely wasn't lost. My gut told me Cheryl had decided that if the HOA couldn't win with cones, notices, or driveway blockades, she'd outsource the job. The Queen needed mercenaries. The next morning, I found muddy tire tracks cut into the edge of my lawn. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just an intentional scar carved into my grass like a calling card. Subtle intimidation. The HOA board didn't have the guts to get their hands dirty themselves, so they'd found someone else to do it. That was the first time I realized just how deep Cheryl's need for control ran. She wasn't just satisfied humiliating me, she needed to prove she could make me bend. That morning, I drove to work with a smile anyway. She thought intimidation would make me fold. What she didn't realize was that all intimidation does is make me build bigger traps. That evening I reinforced the perimeter with more mat. The originals had horns. The new ones had something extra, die packs. Not the bank-level exploding ones, but modified paint canisters rigged to pop if too much weight pressed down. I tested them with cinder blocks. They went off with a satisfying splatter, coating the block in neon blue paint. If Cheryl wanted to keep sending her pawns, they'd go home looking like they wrestled a smurf. The traps weren't even out for 24 hours before I got my proof. At 2 a.m., the motion camera snapped on. The Ford rolled up again. Two figures climbed out, hoodies pulled tight, stomping straight toward my driveway with a kind of swagger that only comes from people who think they're untouchable. They didn't even hesitate, they went right for the mat. The first guy stepped, and the paint pack exploded like a water balloon. He yelped, slipped, and fell backward onto the second mat, setting off the horn. The sound shrieked across the neighborhood, dogs barking in chorus, windows lighting up. The second guy tried to pull him up, but his hands smeared with paint and he lost grip. Both scrambled into the truck, one covered head to toe in blue, the other tripping over his shoelaces in panic. The Ford peeled out, fishtailing down the street while my camera captured the entire fiasco. By morning, the video was clipped, captioned, and circulating in the group chat. HOA brings in backup, backup gets slimed. Someone added circus music. Cheryl didn't come out of her house that day. But Greg, her treasurer sidekick, was spotted trying to hose blue streaks off the Ford parked in his driveway. That's when it clicked. Cheryl hadn't hired strangers, she had roped in her own board members to do the dirty work. The sheriff came by later, leaning on his cruiser like he was enjoying the show as much as anyone. "Heard you had some vandals last night," he said, smirking. "Funny thing though. Blue paint all over Greg's yard this morning. Real coincidence." I shrugged. "Guess it's hard to keep clean when you're messing with other people's property." The sheriff chuckled, told me to keep doing what I was doing, and left. His casual approval was all the shield I needed. But Cheryl didn't back down. If anything, the paint incident pushed her to raise the stakes. A few days later, I got a certified letter in the mail. Thick envelope, stamped with legal insignia. Inside was a cease and desist letter drafted by a local attorney. It accused me of harassment, endangerment, and creating hostile living conditions. I laughed out loud. Cheryl had actually lawyered up. I knew exactly how much HOA funds could handle. Between landscaping contracts and pool maintenance, their budget was tighter than they let on. She was burning money to fight me, and that told me one thing: I was winning. I didn't reply to the letter. Instead, I mailed a copy of my camera footage, horns blaring, paint spraying, Cheryl's stooges slipping, to the attorney listed on the letterhead. No note, no explanation, just the raw evidence. 2 days later, I got a call. The attorney's assistant politely informed me their office would no longer be representing the HOA in this matter. Cheryl had burned her bridge with her own hired help. The board tried a new tactic the next week: public shaming. At the monthly HOA newsletter drop, every mailbox in the neighborhood got a glossy printout featuring a photo of my mats with the words "Neighborhood Menace" in bold across the top. The letter warned residents that dangerous devices had been installed and urged them to exercise caution when passing my property. They even accused me of terrorizing children, though they couldn't cite a single incident. Instead of being afraid, I framed the newsletter and hung it in my hallway like a trophy. Then I printed smaller copies and handed them out at the next block barbecue. "I'd autograph these," I joked, "but Cheryl hasn't sent me my royalty check yet." Neighbors laughed. A few even asked if I was planning new landmines. I told them, only if Cheryl keeps donating cars for testing. That line earned me a round of beers. It was becoming clear that Cheryl's grip on the neighborhood was slipping. The more she escalated, the more ridiculous she looked, and the more people sided with me. Her strategy of intimidation was backfiring spectacularly. But people like Cheryl don't just crumble quietly. They claw. They scheme. And when the walls close in, they get dangerous. One night, I heard voices outside my window. Quiet, hushed, deliberate. I slipped onto the porch and saw Cheryl herself standing in the street with Greg and Denise. They weren't yelling this time. They were whispering, pointing at my yard, sketching something on a notepad. My camera caught the whole thing. They noticed me watching and scattered like guilty teenagers. But I knew what it meant. Cheryl wasn't sending pawns anymore. She was leading the charge. Sure enough, 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of metal scraping. Someone was tampering with my mailbox. I stayed quiet, watching through the blinds. Cheryl, in full yoga gear at midnight, was shoving an envelope inside. The next morning, I opened it to find a single sheet of paper with block letters cut from magazines like a ransom note. "Remove the traps or else." I actually laughed so hard I spilled my coffee. She'd gone from HOA president to dollar store villain. But even that didn't prepare me for what came next. Saturday morning, I stepped out to grab the paper and nearly tripped over it. A brand new, gleaming chain stretched across the mouth of my driveway. Heavy duty, padlocked at both ends to metal stake. Cheryl had finally decided if she couldn't block me with cars, she'd block me with hardware. It was bold. It was reckless. And it was the biggest mistake she'd made yet. I didn't touch the chain. Instead, I called the sheriff, showed him the padlocked blockade, and handed over the ransom note letter. He stared at it, then at the chain, then at me. "You know," he said, trying not to laugh, "I really should be mad about this. But honestly, I've been waiting all week to see what she'd do next." The morning after the chain incident, the neighborhood had the electric buzz of gossip that usually only follows a scandal at City Hall. People walking their dogs slowed down to glance at my driveway, whispering about the padlocked blockade and the sheriff's warning. For once, I wasn't the one under suspicion. Cheryl had crossed a line too visibly this time. But I knew her. Silence wasn't her waving a white flag. It was her gearing up for something bolder, something she thought would flip the narrative back in her favor. I didn't have to wait long to find out what it was. By midweek, I opened my mailbox to a bright orange flyer, glossy paper, professional design. Community Safety Initiative, the headline screamed in all caps. Underneath, in smaller but still aggressive font, it said, "Because some residents choose chaos over harmony." Cheryl had launched an entire campaign, complete with graphics of children holding hands and smiling parents, to paint me as the villain. The flyer invited everyone to a community safety rally on Saturday morning in Cheryl's front yard. I almost admired the audacity. She wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was trying to rally the neighborhood into a mob. If she couldn't beat me with rules, fines, or chains, she'd try to bury me under peer pressure. But here's the thing about mobs. They only work if the crowd believes the leader. And I had already planted plenty of doubt about Cheryl's leadership. When Saturday rolled around, I set my porch chair at the end of my driveway with a cooler and a pair of binoculars. From there, I had a perfect view of Cheryl's lawn. A canopy tent had been set up, rows of folding chairs lined the sidewalk, and a rented podium stood front and center. Cheryl was in her element, fluttering around in a red blazer, greeting people like she was running for Congress. Greg and Denise manned the snack table, passing out lemonade with smiles that looked more like grimaces. About 40 people showed up, more than I expected. But I noticed something interesting. They weren't all loyalists. A lot of them came for the same reason I was watching: curiosity. People love a spectacle. Cheryl took the podium, cleared her throat, and launched into her speech. She painted a picture of herself as the tireless protector of the neighborhood, framed me as a menace with booby traps and reckless disregard for children, and warned that if we don't act now, our community will be overrun with chaos. I almost spit out my drink. Cheryl wasn't just trying to shame me, she was trying to start her own little cult. The more dramatic her language got, the more I realized she wasn't talking to the crowd anymore. She was talking to herself, trying to rebuild the control she'd lost. When she called for a vote to formally censure me, hands hesitated in the air. Some rose, some stayed down, some waved half-heartedly. That's when I made my move. I pulled out my phone, opened the group chat, and dropped a 30-second video clip. Cheryl, in her slippers, dragging the illegal chain across my driveway while muttering to Greg about teaching me a lesson. The timing was perfect. Phones in the crowd buzzed one by one. Heads bent, eyes widened, murmurs spread like wildfire. Cheryl noticed the shift in attention, her voice cracking as she demanded focus. But once the evidence hit, she couldn't regain it. A teenager in the back actually booed. A man near the front muttered, "Unbelievable," loud enough for everyone to hear. Cheryl's face turned crimson. She tried to pivot, blaming deepfakes and misrepresentation, but the crowd wasn't buying it. By the end of her rally, less than half the chairs were filled. People were drifting away, shaking their heads. Her grand plan to unite the block had fizzled into public embarrassment. That night, I got 3 texts from different neighbors thanking me for standing up to the HOA. One even asked if I could help him rig horns for his driveway. The balance of power was shifting, and Cheryl knew it. Which is why I wasn't surprised when her next move wasn't subtle. It was an all-out declaration of war. 2 days later, I woke up to the sound of hammering. Cheryl and her crew were erecting a massive wooden barricade at the end of the cul-de-sac. Not across my driveway this time, but across the entire street. A big, ugly wall of plywood painted with the words, "Private HOA Road, Trespassers will be reported." The problem? Our street wasn't private. It was a public road, maintained by the city. Cheryl had finally leapt from petty rule-bending to outright delusion. Cars stacked up quickly that morning. Delivery vans honked. A school bus couldn't turn around. Neighbors poured out of their houses demanding answers. Cheryl, standing tall beside her barricade, proclaimed, "We're protecting our community from dangerous influences." People looked at her like she had lost her mind. I didn't call the sheriff this time. I called the city. Within 2 hours, a code enforcement officer rolled up in a white truck, clipboard in hand. He took one look at the barricade, jotted a note, and told Cheryl she had 1 hour to remove it before the city fined her personally for obstructing public property. Cheryl sputtered about emergency safety measures, But the officer didn't care. The barricade came down piece by piece, Greg and Denise sweating in the sun as they dragged boards back to Cheryl's yard. And yet, I knew this humiliation wouldn't be enough. Cheryl had too much pride invested now. When bullies lose ground, they don't reflect. They escalate. Sure enough, that night my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch were 2 police officers. Not the sheriff this time, but city cop. They said they'd received an anonymous tip about illegal weapons on my property. I let them in without hesitation. Showed them the mats, the horns, even demonstrated one by tossing a bag of mulch on it. The horns screamed, they jumped, then laughed. "That's it?" one asked, still chuckling. I nodded. "That's it. My landmines." They shook their heads, wrote up a report saying no violations were found, and left. I didn't need a signed confession to know Cheryl had made the call. What she hadn't realized was that bringing outside law enforcement into our feud was the riskiest move yet. She'd taken things beyond the HOA, beyond the neighborhood. And once you invite bigger players into your games, you can't always control how they play. The next morning, the sheriff himself came by, leaning against his cruiser with his usual grin. "City cops told me about your landmines," he said. They couldn't stop laughing. "Between you and me, Cheryl's giving us better entertainment than Netflix." But he leaned closer, his smile fading just a fraction. "She's getting desperate. People like her? Desperation makes them sloppy. You might want to be ready for something really stupid." That stuck with me. Cheryl had already crossed into illegal territory with chains and barricade. What was left for her to try? I had no answer yet. But as the sun set and I watched her pacing her porch, phone glued to her ear, I could see it in her body language. She was planning her biggest move yet. The war had stopped being about my driveway. It was about control. About ego. About Cheryl proving she could bend reality to her will. And I had no doubt her next attempt would test just how far she was willing to go. And I knew one thing for certain: I'd be ready when she did. The first sign that Cheryl's next move had arrived was the smell of gasoline. Not strong, not overwhelming, but faint enough to make me pause as I stepped outside on Monday morning. My driveway was clear, the mats still in place, but there was a suspicious dark stain right at the edge of the curb. I crouched down, sniffed, and knew immediately it wasn't oil. Someone had poured gas, then either thought better of it or been interrupted before they could light a match. That was when I stopped laughing about Cheryl's antics. Up until then, it had been ridiculous, infuriating, humiliating, but now it was dangerous. I checked the camera footage. At 2 in the morning, the grainy figure of Greg appeared, lugging a plastic container, looking over his shoulder. He bent down, poured something across the edge of my drive, and jerked upright at the sound of a barking dog. He bolted back into the shadows, container in hand. I watched it twice, jaw clenched. This wasn't Cheryl sending letters or cones. This was her sending people to my property with accelerant. I knew I could call the sheriff right away, but something in me wanted to hold the footage like a loaded weapon. If I dropped it too early, Cheryl would pivot, paint herself the victim again. If I waited, I could stack the evidence until there was no room left for excuses. My father's voice echoed in my head, "Don't waste the good trap before it's ripe." So I saved the clip in 3 different places, labeled it Greg's Midnight Errand, and waited. That week, Cheryl shifted tactics again, this time toward outright psychological warfare. Flyers reappeared, only instead of glossy newsletters, they were crude photocopies stuffed into mailboxes. "Is your family safe?" the headline asked, followed by paragraphs warning about booby traps, explosives, and hostile neighbors. Each flyer ended with the same line: "Say no to driveway terrorism." The irony that her treasurer had tried to douse my curb in gasoline seemed lost on her. Neighbors weren't convinced. I overheard 2 women at the mailbox laughing about the terrorism flyers, one saying, "If anyone's terrorizing us, it's Cheryl with her circus." Still, I could sense her desperation metastasizing. Public embarrassment hadn't broken her. Losing allies hadn't broken her. Being warned by law enforcement hadn't broken her. Now she was leaning into fear-mongering. When tyrants lose power, they don't fade, they ignite. By Thursday, Cheryl unveiled her boldest stunt yet. I came home from work to find an entire construction crew at the end of the cul-de-sac. Bright vests, orange cones, jackhammers rattling the air. They were tearing up the asphalt right where my driveway met the street. I parked down the block and stormed over, demanding to know who authorized this. The foreman waved a clipboard at me, shrugging. We were hired to install a community speed bump. Cash payment up front. The so-called speed bump was a slab of rebar and concrete that would have completely blocked my ability to back out. Cheryl stood nearby in sunglasses, pretending to chat with Denise as though she just happened to be supervising construction in her yard heels. When I pointed directly at her, she smiled sweetly and said, "Community safety project. You wouldn't want children speeding through the cul-de-sac, would you?" That was the moment I decided enough was enough. I called the sheriff on speakerphone, loud enough for everyone to hear. When I explained the situation, the foreman's face went pale. He hadn't pulled a permit. He hadn't checked with the city. He'd just taken Cheryl's envelope of cash and assumed it was legitimate. By the time the sheriff arrived, the crew had packed up their tools and driven off, leaving half a trench of torn asphalt in front of my driveway. Cheryl tried to act outraged, insisting she was just protecting the neighborhood, but the sheriff wasn't in the mood. "Lady," he said, hand resting casually on his belt, "if I have to explain to you one more time what you can and can't do with public property, you're gonna be learning it from a holding cell." Cheryl's cheeks burned crimson. For the first time, she didn't argue. She just stomped back into her house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the window glass. That night, I thought about sending the gasoline footage to the sheriff, to end things once and for all. But something stopped me. The story wasn't finished yet. Cheryl had one more card to play, I could feel it. And if I forced the finale too soon, she'd find a way to slither out of it. No, the better move was to let her dig the hole herself. And dig she did. The following evening, the unmarked Ford was back, this time with Cheryl herself in the passenger seat. I caught them on camera unloading bags of gravel and spreading them across my driveway like they were salting the earth. Their plan, apparently, was to create a surface so rough it would shred my tires if I drove out. What they didn't realize was that I had already anticipated something like this. Underneath the mats, I'd installed a second layer of pressure triggers. This time connected not to horns, not to paint, but to sprinklers. Industrial-grade, high-pressure sprinklers. The moment Greg set down the last bag, he stepped back onto the mat. The trigger snapped, and a jet of icy water shot straight into his chest, followed by two more that sprayed in wide arcs. Within seconds, Cheryl and Greg were drenched, gravel floating in little rivers down the street. They screamed, scrambled for the truck, and peeled off into the night, water streaming after them like they'd been chased by a fire hose. By morning, the group chat had another new video. Cheryl shrieking, soaked to the bone, mascara running down her cheeks like war paint. Neighbors roasted marshmallows on memes of her face. Someone even nicknamed her Sprinkler Karen. I didn't post the clip myself. It leaked from a neighbor's porch cam. Cheryl's war for control had turned into a running neighborhood comedy show, and everyone knew it. But then things took a darker turn. Saturday night, I woke to sirens. Not for me, for Cheryl. Her front yard was ablaze, flames licking at her bushes. Fire trucks screamed into the cul-de-sac, hoses blasting. The fire was contained quickly, but word spread that someone had tossed a lit firework into her shrubs. She immediately pointed fingers at me, shouting to the firefighters that I was terrorizing her. But when the fire marshal asked for proof, she had none. In fact, when they checked, they found remnants of her own gasoline-soaked rags in the yard, suggesting the fire had started from her own supplies. By dawn, the rumor mill was vicious. Half the neighborhood believed Cheryl had staged the fire herself to frame me. The other half believed she'd simply lost control of her reckless schemes. Either way, her credibility was ash. Greg avoided eye contact. Denise stayed indoors. Cheryl stood on her porch, glaring at me across the street with the intensity of a general who had lost every battle but refused to surrender the war. The final act of Cheryl's unraveling began on a Sunday morning so still it felt staged. No barking dogs, no lawn mowers, not even the usual joggers passing by. Just an eerie calm over the cul-de-sac, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. I was sipping my coffee on the porch when I noticed Cheryl pacing in her driveway. She had a clipboard in one hand, a phone pressed to her ear with the other. Her movements were frantic, jerky, not the deliberate prance of someone in control. She was unraveling in real time, and everyone who glanced out their window could see it. By noon, the sound of heavy machinery shattered the quiet. A flatbed truck rolled in, hauling 2 industrial concrete barriers. Behind it came a skid-steer loader. Cheryl had outdone herself this time. She had rented construction equipment, the kind of equipment you only bring out when you want to build or block something that lasts. I stepped off my porch as the crew unloaded the barriers at the mouth of my driveway. Each slab was taller than me, wide enough to block the entire entrance. The loader beeped as it pushed one into position. I could feel my neighbor's curtains fluttering as people watched the insanity unfold. Cheryl, standing proudly in her sun hat and oversized sunglasses, directed the workers like a dictator unveiling a monument. "What exactly are you doing?" I called out. "Community improvement project," she replied with a smug smile. "Traffic calming measure. Approved by the HOA board." "Funny," I said, pulling out my phone. "Because the city owns this road. And I doubt they signed off on your personal Berlin Wall." She ignored me, turning back to the loader operator. But her voice wavered just slightly. She was bluffing, relying on intimidation and the hope that nobody would challenge her in the moment. Unfortunately for her, intimidation only works if your opponent doesn't have a camera in one hand and the sheriff's number on speed dial in the other. I didn't even need to make the call. One of the neighbors had already dialed. Within 30 minutes, 2 squad cars rolled up, lights flashing. The officers stepped out, took one look at the barriers, and exchanged that expression cops get when they realize they've stumbled into a circus. "Ma'am," one of them said to Cheryl, "do you have a permit for this?" "This is HOA approved," she snapped, waving her clipboard like it was Holy Writ. "HOA approval isn't a legal permit," the officer replied. "This is obstruction of a public roadway. You need to remove it immediately." Cheryl's face twisted into something between rage and panic. "He's endangering children with his traps. I'm protecting the community." The officer held up a hand. "That's not how this works. Move it, or we'll cite you for obstruction." That's when Cheryl did the one thing I didn't expect. She screamed. Not words, just a raw, throat-shredding sound of frustration that startled even the loader operator. Then she ran forward, climbed into the machine, and tried to operate it herself. The operator jumped back, shouting. The loader jerked forward, tires grinding, metal buckets swinging dangerously close to Greg, who was hovering nearby with his usual clipboard. The cops lunged, shouting for her to stop, but Cheryl fumbled with the controls like a toddler with a steering wheel. The loader lurched again, smashing into one of the barriers and toppling it sideways. The slab crashed onto the curb, cracking the asphalt, sending a spray of dust into the air. Neighbors gasped from behind their curtains. Someone actually clapped. The officers dragged Cheryl out of the cab, arms flailing, sun hat flying off into the street. She shrieked about tyranny and illegal surveillance and how I was terrorizing her family. Her words tumbled into incoherent sobs as they cuffed her and led her toward the squad car. For a moment, she looked less like the iron-fisted HOA president and more like a lost child throwing her last tantrum. The barriers, half installed, half destroyed, sat like monuments to her meltdown. The loader operator stood awkwardly to the side, shaking his head. Greg muttered something about miscommunication, and slunk back toward his house. Denise wasn't even present, probably realizing the ship had sunk and choosing not to drown with it. But I wasn't celebrating yet, because Cheryl wasn't finished, not truly. Even cuffed in the back of a squad car, she was shouting about lawsuits, lawyers, and vengeance. And part of me knew she meant it. For people like her, the fight doesn't end when the cuffs click. It ends only when they're completely, irreversibly exposed. So I pulled out the folder I'd been compiling. The gasoline footage. The ransom note. The paint-smeared vandals. The sprinkler ambush. The illegal chain. I sent it all to the sheriff's office that afternoon. Not as a demand for charges, not yet. Just as a record. Evidence stacked so high it could crush any excuse she tried to manufacture. By Monday, word spread that Cheryl had been released with a citation and a court date. The barricade stunt had finally crossed the invisible line between HOA pettiness and criminal behavior. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Some people whispered she might step down. Others said she'd double down. Me? I knew she'd do both. Pretend to step down while plotting her revenge behind the scenes. Sure enough, Tuesday morning, I found a new envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten this time. Enjoy your victory. This isn't over. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Cheryl couldn't stop herself. She'd gone from rules to intimidation to sabotage to outright felonies, and still, she thought she could claw her way back. She hadn't realized yet that the more she fought, the deeper she buried herself. That week, the HOA held an emergency meeting. I didn't attend, but I heard plenty. Attendance was sparse. Cheryl was technically still president, but her credibility was shot. Neighbors grilled Greg about finances. Someone demanded to know why HOA dues had been spent on concrete barriers and construction equipment. Denise, cornered, stammered about temporary measures before storming out. By the end of the night, several neighbors were openly talking about dissolving the HOA entirely. For the first time since this war began, I felt the tide fully turn. This wasn't just about me versus Cheryl anymore. It was Cheryl versus everyone. And everyone was done with her. Still, I stayed cautious. Bullies don't stop until they're forced to. And Cheryl, humiliated, cornered, and stripped of her power, was at her most dangerous. She wouldn't slink away quietly. She would come back with something dramatic, reckless, and final. And she did. Late Friday night, my cameras picked up movement again. Cheryl, alone this time, dragging something heavy across the street. A can of paint. She began scrawling words across the pavement in front of my driveway, big looping letters visible even in the grainy night vision. Terrorist. Danger. Monster. She was defacing public property herself now, too far gone to realize the irony. Her hair was wild, her clothes wrinkled, her movements manic. She was unraveling completely. And as I watched from inside, coffee in hand, I knew we were approaching the grand finale. By the time dawn broke on Saturday, Cheryl's late-night graffiti had hardened into an ugly scar across the asphalt. Big block letters screamed "terrorist" and "monster" in neon orange, stretching right across the mouth of my driveway like a warning sign. She'd even added arrows pointing directly at my house, in case any delivery driver or passing stranger needed directions to the villain's lair. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. If her goal was to shame me, she'd only managed to advertise her own obsession. I didn't rush to clean it. Instead, I brewed my coffee, pulled up a chair on the porch, and waited. One by one, the neighborhood stirred awake. Curtains opened. People stepped out for newspapers, morning walks, dog duty. And then the whispers began. A teenager biking by stopped, laughed, and shouted, "Nice art, Karen," before pedaling away. Across the street, a dad in sweatpants took a picture and muttered, "That's it, she's lost it." Within half an hour, half the block had seen her work. Cheryl emerged around 9, wearing her blazer like armor, as though dressing sharp could paper over the unraveling. She strutted across the street, chin high, pretending the graffiti was some official warning, not her own meltdown. "This community deserves to know the danger it's in," she declared to no one in particular. Most neighbors ignored her. A few shook their heads and went back inside. One woman asked if Cheryl had finally lost her mind. Cheryl didn't answer. By late morning, the sheriff arrived. Not in a rush, not lights blazing, just his cruiser rolling slow and steady into the cul-de-sac. He parked directly on top of the graffiti, killing the engine with deliberate weight, tires grinding Cheryl's message into the pavement. When he stepped out, coffee in one hand, paperwork in the other, the crowd of gawking neighbors quieted into an eager hush. He looked down at the orange letters beneath his boots, then up at Cheryl. "You want to explain this?" he asked casually, like he already knew the answer. "This is evidence," Cheryl snapped, pointing at me. "He's endangering us all, and I won't be silenced by bureaucracy." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "So, just to be clear, you admit you painted this?" I performed a public service." He nodded, scribbling something on his clipboard. "A public service called vandalism. On city property. In broad daylight. While on probation for obstruction." His voice carried just enough for the neighbors to hear. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Cheryl's face flushed crimson. She stammered about conspiracies, about how the sheriff was protecting a terrorist. But the sheriff wasn't listening anymore. He turned to me. "You got those videos we talked about?" I didn't say a word. I just walked inside, came back out with a thumb drive, and handed it over. Everything was on it. The gasoline attempt, the chain, the fake barricade, the paint packs, the sprinklers, the construction scam, even the midnight graffiti. Layer upon layer of her spiral, stitched together like a highlight reel of self-destruction. The sheriff pocketed it. "Appreciate it." Then he turned back to Cheryl. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." The sound that came out of Cheryl's throat was halfway between a scream and a laugh. "You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president." The sheriff chuckled. "Not for long, I reckon." He gestured to the cruiser. Cheryl hesitated, trembling, then finally let him guide her into the back seat. As the door shut, her face pressed against the glass, wild-eyed, shouting muffled threats nobody could hear. When the cruiser rolled away, the cul-de-sac erupted, not in chaos but in applause. Actual applause. People stepped out of their houses clapping, some whistling, others recording. A teenager yelled, "Sprinkler Karen strikes again," and the whole block laughed. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter. But for me, the real satisfaction wasn't in her arrest. It was in the silence that followed. No more engines idling across my driveway at night. No more cones, no more chains, no more half-baked barricades. Just quiet. The HOA called an emergency meeting that afternoon. This time I attended. The folding chairs were less than half full. Greg resigned on the spot, mumbling something about family time. Denise tried to salvage authority by reading from her binder, but when a neighbor asked why HOA dues had been used to rent construction equipment, she went pale, packed her things, and left. By the end of the meeting, the motion to dissolve the board entirely passed with a majority vote. The HOA that had terrorized the neighborhood for years ended not with a bang, but with a shrug. For the first time since moving in, I felt free. My driveway was mine again. My mornings were mine again. The mats? I left them in place, not out of necessity anymore, but as trophies. Little reminders of the war Cheryl thought she could win with intimidation, and how every trap she set for me ended up detonating under her own feet. Weeks later, Cheryl's house went on the market. Rumor had it the court fines and legal fees were too much for her to handle. She left town quietly, no farewell, no parade. Just one day gone, her reign ended. The new family who moved in never mentioned her name. Nobody did, not really. She'd become less a memory and more a cautionary tale. Every once in a while, I still catch the sheriff driving through our neighborhood. He'll slow down near my driveway, roll down his window, and grin. "How are those landmines holding up?" he'll ask. And I'll nod, raise my coffee, and say, "Haven't gone off since the war ended." He always laughs, shakes his head, and drives on. It wasn't the traps that won, really. It wasn't the horns or the paint or the sprinklers. It was patience. Cheryl thought she could outshout, outfine, outintimidate everyone. But she never understood the long game. That's what undid her. Not a single moment, but the accumulation of her own pettiness, exposed one absurdity at a time until there was nothing left of her but ridicule. Sometimes I wonder if she'll try again somewhere else, in some other HOA, with some other unlucky neighbor. Maybe she'll even succeed for a while. But eventually, she'll meet someone who knows the secret my father taught me. Every problem has a solution, and the best ones are traps the problem walks into willingly. I glance at the mats now and then, smile at the memories, and think about how a war that started with blocked driveways ended with the neighborhood cheering as the sheriff drove away. People tell me it's ridiculous, unbelievable even, that anyone could go that far over control of a cul-de-sac. But I lived it. And if I learned anything, it's this. You don't need real landmines to win a war. You just need patience, humor, and the willingness to let entitled people bury themselves in their own absurdity. And Cheryl? She buried herself deeper than anyone could have imagined. The sheriff wasn't wrong when he said it was better than Netflix.